In Genesis chapter 24. We will complete this today, and then we'll go through the next section in chapter 25. We'll have a couple of missionaries that will be here on September the 8th to lead in our worship service, and then the following Sunday I'll begin the book of Galatians. So we're going to take this pause in Genesis. I can't promise how long that pause will be, but this has been a very long journey. So I am thrilled to be here in chapter 24. I'm looking forward to getting into Galatians. So we come to what is the longest narrative within this section of Genesis, probably within all of the book of Genesis itself, as we continue in the search for a bride for Isaac. And so Abraham is making final preparations for the ultimate fulfillment of the promise that was made to him, and that is that he would become the father of a great nation. Future Israel is what is in light here. And so if Abraham is going to have descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky, well, Isaac's got to get busy pretty quick, right? Because Abraham's nearing 175 years old, and at this point, Isaac doesn't have a wife, and so this numerous descendancy is just not yet on track. So we looked at the commission, and this was Abraham who sends his oldest and most trusted servant with the task of going out and finding a bride for Isaac. Abraham requires, and the servant agrees to this oath, and that he will perform this task exactly as Abraham has asked him to. Isaac's bride cannot come from amongst the Canaanites, amongst whom he lives. She must come from Abraham's family. Therefore, the servant is to go back to Abraham's homeland, which we learn is Nahor, and he is to find a bride for Isaac from amongst his family outside of the region of the Canaanites. And so the servant agrees to this. He makes this journey, which is several hundred miles, takes him several months to complete. We see the servant's faith, and as he is making this journey, most assuredly is praying for God's guidance, for God's assistance as he carries out this task on behalf of his master. So as he is arriving into the city, he is praying for God's provision, and as he is uttering the words of this prayer in his heart, Rebekah shows up at the well. She carries forth the specifics of what the servant had actually prayed for, that she would not only water the thirsty servant, but would also offer to water all of the camels as well. He later learns that she is from Abraham's family, and it appears very obviously that Rebekah is in fact the one that God has chosen to become the wife of Isaac. So he gives Rebekah some jewelry. He asks for some lodging. Rebekah agrees, and then they are off to meet the family. And so the servant, along with Rebekah, go back to Rebekah's home. They meet the family. The servant tells the family who it is that he represents: Abraham, one of your descendants, ancestors, family, the great Abraham, whom God has richly blessed. He's seeking a wife for the soon-to-be rich Isaac, which is great news for Rebekah's brother Laban, who possesses the characteristic of being greedy. We'll learn more about that eventually as we go through the life of Jacob many, many years later in a couple of chapters away. The family agrees to allow Rebekah to marry Isaac, and after an evening of celebration, they awake on the following day, and the servant says it's time to go. The family hesitates and says, let's let her stay here for a few more days, maybe 10. And they say, well, let's ask Rebekah what she wants to do. The servant was unwilling to hesitate. And so Rebekah says, I will go. And so Rebekah, like Abraham, displays great faith in leaving her homeland and her family for a man that will be shown to her, just as Abraham left his family and his homeland for a land that would be shown to him. So there is a parallel here between Rebekah and Abraham. We'll look at that in just a moment. And so with Rebekah prepared to leave for the unknown, we complete the remainder of this portion of the narrative, and that is as we look at God's faithfulness and the blessing that is going to come here. So we're going to read all of this next section, verse 60 through the end of chapter 24, verse 67. Let's read together. I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. They blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them. Then Rebekah arose with her maids, and they mounted the camels and followed the man. So the servant took Rebekah and departed. Now Isaac had come from going to Be'er Lahai-roi, for he was living in the Negev. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, camels were coming. Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel. She said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "He is my master." Then she took her veil and covered herself. The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So as you notice here, we have letter C, number 7 in the ongoing outline. There was a little bit at the tail end of this section of God's faithfulness that I wanted to spend some time on that I wouldn't have time to have done last week. So we kind of continue in section C, but this will be a little less than a third of what it is we're going to do today. So as I mentioned, there is a parallel between Abraham and Rebekah that is drawn out based upon the fact that she is going to leave her family and her homeland, and then also with the blessing that is prayed here. So look again at verse 60. They, the family, blessed Rebekah and said to her, "May you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them." So the they here is the family of Rebekah, and it reflects the wishes of the family, but you'll also notice that it says, "May you, our sister," and that seems to indicate that Laban is taking the lead in issuing the blessing, just as Laban had taken the lead when the servant came to meet the family and talk about who he was and where he had come from and why he was there. And so for reasons that really can't be explained with great clarity, is why didn't Rebekah's father take the lead in that meeting with the servant, and why isn't the father taking the lead here in the issuance of this blessing? And the only conclusion that can be drawn is because Rebekah's father plays almost no role in the following sections that would come from the book of Genesis. But Laban, however, is going to be a prominent character, most especially as it relates to Jacob, the child of Isaac and Rebekah, in a couple of chapters down the way many years later. So again, Laban will become a prominent character in the life of Jacob, and so it's likely that this is why he is more front and center here than is Rebekah's father, Bethuel. So the blessing here focuses on the eventual descendants that are going to come from Isaac and Rebekah's union, and there's two parts to that. The first one is this, letter A. There's the blessing that they would be numerous, the descendants would be very numerous. While this is not necessarily an uncommon component of a family blessing prior to a wedding, because after all, every parent wants grandkids, right? But the number thousands of 10,000s is quite extraordinary, and I don't know that I would ever think to pray a blessing over my kids that there would be thousands of 10,000s of descendants. I mean, I couldn't even fathom such a number, but this is part of what the blessing is, and it is very similar to the promise that God gave to both Abraham and to Sarah. So as we think back to Genesis 15:5, God, took Abraham outside and said, "Now look towards the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." An unfathomable amount. We can look out into the stars of the sky, and there's no possible way that we could even begin to count them. Isn't that right? And so when Abraham looks into the heavens and sees the stars, he says, "Wow, that's a lot of descendants. I don't understand how that's ever going to come to pass, but this is the promise of God." So likewise, God says the same thing of Sarah in Genesis 17:16. God says to Abraham, "I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations," plural, "kings," plural, "of peoples will come from her." So what this gives us an insight into is the fact that the descendants that are going to come from Abraham and Sarah are more numerous than can be counted, but there is a plurality of nations and people groups that are going to come from this union between Abraham and Sarah. So Isaac and Rebekah are going to pick up that torch, and they are going to carry it on into the beginning of this multitude of descendants that would not just be the nation of Israel, but it would be a multitude of nations, peoples, plural, more numerous than we can even begin to count even today. So as I've mentioned before, there's no indication of any kind that Rebekah's family worshipped Yahweh as Abraham did. Yet Rebekah's family has issued a blessing that is consistent with what God has promised to Abraham and to Sarah, and by virtue of Isaac being the son of the covenant, these promises would also apply to him. And if you were to go on and read in the next chapters of Genesis, you'll see the same blessing promised to Isaac from the Lord himself. So what Rebekah is hearing from her probably pagan family is a blessing that is very reminiscent of what the Lord had promised to Abraham and to Sarah. So Moses' intent, remembering that he likely wrote this during the period of the wilderness wanderings, Moses' intent here is to ensure the reader, us and future Israel, that Rebekah is the divinely chosen individual for the continuation of the blessing given to Abraham and to Sarah, and the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise of a nation. Remember, the promises given to Abraham were land, nation, and blessing. He's in the land, but he does not yet own the land, although he is body portion of it. He has been richly blessed, but the promise of nation will not be fulfilled in Abraham's lifetime, nor will it be fulfilled in Isaac or Jacob's lifetime. Not until Moses comes onto the scene will the promise of nation begin to take shape. So the first promise, or the first blessing that is issued here, is that the descendants would be numerous, and letter B, that they be victorious. So the inclusion of, quote, may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them, end quote, echoes the promise that God made to Abraham after he stopped him in the midst of sacrificing his son Isaac. So if you remember, we read in Genesis chapter 22:17, God says, indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of the enemies. So in all the times that God had made the promise to Abraham and had restated the pieces of that promise, not until here in Genesis 22 did he ever say anything about enemies and about possessing the gate of those enemies. So Rebekah is eventually going to hear from the Lord herself in Genesis chapter 25 when she is pregnant with Jacob and Esau, and God is going to say to her in 25:23, the Lord Yahweh said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body, and one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So what Rebekah is hearing in the form of a blessing and a prayer of sorts, she is going to hear repeated from the Lord in Genesis chapter 25, and it's an indication of these potential enemies and the need of the possession of their gate, which is being hinted at here in Genesis chapter 25. Now, as you think about that, where God says to Rebekah that 2 nations are going to come from within your body, 2 people groups, one of the covenant, one not in the covenant, just as has been real prior to the birth of Jacob and Esau, there is a hint of what is yet to come in the lives of the descendants that are going to come, not only from Abraham and Sarah, but also from also from Isaac and from Rebekah. So as was promised to Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, the descendants are going to be numerous and will in fact give birth to many nations. This was hinted at all the way back in chapters 10 and 11 with the table of nations that were going to be the eventual descendants that are going to come from Noah's family. So Rebekah, like Abraham, is hearing in the context of this blessing that there is a desire for, a need for victory over the enemies of these descendants that are going to come, which indicates that conflict and struggle is ahead. So this plurality of nations are not going to be one brotherhood in love. They're going to be many different people groups who are going to not like each other and who are going to attempt to annihilate one another. So there is the hint of this conflict, but there is also this hint of ultimate victory, this prayer that you may possess the gate of your enemies. Now, why would that be a part of the blessing? Think about it like this. If you and I as believers today live in the midst of this spiritual battle, this opposition between God and those who love God and serve God, and the truth of God, those who are in the covenant with God, that battle of those who are not in the covenant of God, the worldly wisdom, the worldly ways, the demonic forces that are really in control of what happens in the day-to-day world, that does not subjugate God's sovereign rule, but what God has delegated as permissible to the demons and the demonic forces, that conflict that is so real and is taking place. And if you and I did not know about the ultimate victory that is ours, how would that change our perspective in the midst of this battle? Do you ever feel weary? Do you ever feel beaten down? Do you ever say, God, when is this going to end? You should. Because if we aren't, then it means we're not really aware of the battle that is going on. We're not really aware of the losses that are being experienced in a life that is not totally committed to Him. We live in the midst of a spiritual battle. We need to be reminded that the victory is ultimately His, and by virtue of that, the ultimate victory is ours today, because greater is He that is in me than he that is in the world. Do we know that? Do we believe that? Do we pray that? Do we claim that? Or do we just ignorantly live our life waiting and hoping that things will eventually be different? Well, the hint at trouble that is to come for the plurality of nations that are to come from Rebekah, from her womb, that conflict is very real today, both physically and spiritually. So from within the descendants of Rebekah, there will be continuous warfare and the struggle for both survival and supremacy. Added to that reality of the two peoples that will come from Rebekah, we add to that the descendants of Ishmael, who is a wild donkey of a man and whose family cannot even get along with itself. You add those peoples to the mix, and you can see while through all of Israel's history they were assaulted and they were battled against and war was waged against them, even as it is today. What is being prayed as a blessing over Rebekah's life is an indication of the challenge that is going to be real for her descendants, and it is also real for us today. The covenant people of God are always going to be in conflict with those who are not a part of the covenant. Jesus said the world is going to hate you, but that's okay because they hated me first, right? But yet the world hates us, and we go, I don't understand what's going on here. I'm a likable guy. I'm pretty nice. I don't bother anybody. Why does the world hate me? Well, because you belong to God. You're part of the covenant. That's just the way that it is. So the covenant people of God are always going to be in conflict physically, most especially in the nation of Israel, as they were always battling for land. And oh, by the way, as they're battling for land today. And that conflict is true spiritually, because it is the demonic forces that are using people as pawns in a bigger game than we can often recognize. We live in the middle of a spiritual battle that God will ultimately win, It has already been won by virtue of the finished work of Christ on the cross, yet it's not fully experienced and realized in our own lives. So Israel has faced an unending physical challenge from her enemies, just as Christians face an unending spiritual challenge from her enemies. And oh, by the way, in many, many parts of the world, Christians are facing a spiritual battle. Why? Because they are persecuted. They are thrown in jail. They are physically beaten. They are mistreated. And we live in this cocoon of protection in America, which we are very thankful for and are very blessed by, but that cocoon has created a very, very significant desensitivity to the reality of the spiritual battle and the need for Christians to be strong in the face of that battle. So the promise God made to Abraham and the blessing issued upon Rebekah reflect the ultimate promise of victory for the people of God. The world will always fight against God and his people, but in the end, the people of God have victory through their faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. I want to read a few verses out of Revelation chapter 21, and I would imagine that many of us, if not all of us, have either heard or have read this, and I hope that you have spent some time to meditate on this promise that God makes to us. John the Revelator says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. And he said, Write, for these words are faithful and true. Then he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost. He who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. Church, that is not a psychologically boost that we are to say, yeah, that probably should be helpful to me. It is a promise from the very throne of God that says God has won, and through him we have won, and one day we will experience in full what we can only dream about today. One day all the fighting against God will be over, and those that belong to him will worship him in fullness, seeing him as he really is. I wonder if you've ever considered a life where we live in a world that is totally devoid of the presence of sin. You know, we gather together in this protected environment of a people who love God and have been saved by God. But my friend, this is a place that is filled with the presence of sin because we are perfect while we are yet still being made perfect. We come in a sinful condition. We listen in a sinful condition. We worship in a sinful condition. And one day, all of the presence of sin will be removed, and we will see him and worship him as he really is. Have you contemplated the joy and the peace that would be experienced if every single person in this world loved God first and loved his neighbor as himself? Can you imagine such a world? What we experience here, week in and week out, barbecue in and barbecue out, is a glimpse of the joy, a glimpse of the peace, a glimpse of the hope, and as wonderful as that is, it cannot compare to the joy and the peace that will one day be ours when we stand before our Savior and look into his face and hear him say, Well done. Come into the rest that has been prepared for you. I can't imagine it. I can dream about it. I can wonder about it. But the day is coming, and it will last for a period of time without end when God's people will dwell in his presence without the presence of sin, without the reminder of loss and pain and sorrow. And there is absolutely no way to describe what that's going to be like. But that is God's promise to you and I today. So number 8 on our outline as we look at this section of God's faithfulness is the departure. Verse 61 here. Then Rebekah arose with her maids, and they mounted the camels and followed the man. So the servant took Rebekah and departed. So with the blessing issued, the servant Rebekah and her maids leave for Canaan to complete the mission of Isaac's need for a wife. Their return is going to be over those same several hundred miles, and it will take them a few months to complete. And all along the way, I am sure that Rebekah will ponder the uncertainty of the life that is going to be hers. So the mentioning of Rebekah's maids here indicate that her father was a wealthy man himself, and these servants are going to accompany her on this journey and into this new life, and I'm sure that they would be a welcome sight for her. Last section here, letter D, it is the completion. The first thing that we see here is the waiting for the fulfillment of the bride to come to me, the waiting for the bride to arrive for her soon-to-be husband. So verses 62 and 63. Now Isaac had come from going to Beer Lahai-roi, for he was living in the Negev. Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, camels were coming. So Isaac knows that the servant has left. He knows what the mission is, and for these many months, he's been waiting and waiting and waiting for the arrival of his soon-to-be bride. So if it took several months to get there and several months to get back, this is likely 6 to 8 months that Isaac has been waiting for this mission to be completed. The location that Isaac has coming from, Beer Lahai-roi, may sound familiar. This is where God spoke to Hagar after she fled from Sarah when Sarah was mistreating her over her jealousy of Hagar's pregnancy. And it is at this place that God spoke to Hagar, issued a promise to her about the child that was going to be born. And as a result of that promise that came to her, Hagar named the location God sees, or God is seeing. That's what Be'er Lahai-roi means. And so she named the well, and this is where Isaac and Rebekah are eventually going to live when Abraham dies. And the fact that Isaac and Rebekah make their home there shows that Isaac has supplanted Ishmael, the firstborn who is outside of the covenant. In this way, Ishmael has nothing over Isaac. Although he is the firstborn, Isaac is the son of the covenant. All that Abraham has is going to be passed on to Isaac. And as we would eventually see next time, Abraham remarries and has other kids and gives gifts to them, but not the inheritance of all that he has, that is, as it is spoken here. And so Isaac will supplant Ishmael, the firstborn, because he and he alone is the son of the covenant. So Isaac arrives home after he has traveled back, and he's in the field meditating. That is the word that is used here. It is a very unusual word, very infrequently used. It has come to mean praying, but its use originally is uncertain. So what we learn here in verse 67 is that after marrying Rebekah, Isaac was comforted from the loss of his mother. So together Isaac is in the field meditating, and as we understand, comforted from the loss of his mother. Together it is assumed by rabbis who have later studied this passage and potentially expanded upon it based upon their understanding and the usage of that term. It is in their belief that Isaac is in the field crying out to God. He is seeking the Lord. He is praying to the Lord. And as we would examine Isaac's life, he very much so walks with the Lord. And so that has been the conclusion from the rabbis as they have studied this, that meditating means that Isaac is likely praying and crying out to the Lord as he is waiting for his bride to come to him, which will be for him the consolation of the loss of his mother. So it is in this moment that Isaac is coming and is in the field. that Rebekah is now coming from this long journey, and they, for the very first time, they see each other. And this brings us to number 2, the meeting, verses 64 and 65. Rebekah lifted up her eyes. When she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel. She said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "He is my master." Then she took her veil and covered herself. So both Isaac and Rebekah have, according to the narrative, lifted up their eyes, and at the same time they have done this, they have seen one another from some distance. And it's love at first sight, right? Isn't that the storybook? Isn't that the way that Disney would make the movie? Is the hearts and all that stuff? You're pounding, it's love at first sight. So they see each other at this moment that they lift up their eyes. And it's interesting here that when asked by Rebekah, who is the man that is coming to meet us, Abraham's oldest and most faithful servant says, "My master," right? All throughout this, he has been called the servant of Abraham. Abraham is his master. And so just as Rebekah is going to replace Sarah as the mother of future Israel, as the matriarch, so is Isaac going to replace Abraham as the patriarch and the father of future Israel. So there is this transition from Abraham being the man to Isaac becoming the man. And here the servant calls Isaac my master. So preparation for the transition is almost completed. Rebekah veils herself, apparently the custom for women prior to their wedding. And what I think is very interesting in this, which is not carried out so much in modern American weddings today. I know when Marcy and I were married, when the bride is marched down the aisle, her veil is taken back. And when she is presented to her prospective groom, the father takes that veil and covers her face. And it is the transition from the role of the father of having responsibility over his daughter. The covering of that veil signifies a transition of you, the groom, now having that role of responsibility and protector of this young woman. I think it's a very, very significant lost tradition, but I wonder if that's not where our tradition was originally rooted in. So for whatever reason, Rebekah has veiled herself, which appears to be the custom of a woman prior to her wedding. We would read later in Genesis that this was carried out, and when Jacob is tricked into marrying Leah instead of Rachel, he can only see her eyes because she's covered. And it was said in ancient Israel that a woman's beauty was seen by her form and by her eyes because it was covered. So that's kind of a side note. Not sure if that makes any difference to you. It kind of stood out to me. So another indication of Isaac's rise in position is that the servant here reports to Isaac, not to Abraham. Who initiated the mission? Who did the oath come from? Who was the oath made to? And while undoubtedly the servant did talk to Abraham, he didn't talk to Abraham first. Verse 66, the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. So the story of the journey, the prayer that was prayed, the meeting of Rebekah at the well, the meeting with the family, the departure on the next day, all confirm for Isaac that the servant has indeed found the woman that God intended for him. And we, the reader, would say, the sovereign hand of God is at work. It is providential that Isaac marry Rebekah, and we make no qualms about saying she was the one. I mean, how could you read the narrative and not come to that conclusion? Well, that's Moses' intent, and that's exactly the way our sovereign God has orchestrated the details of this event in the life of Isaac and to Rebekah. Very quickly, we finish with this, the wedding, verse 67. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So we're not told of a prolonged pre-wedding party. There's no big celebration. There's no lavish meal. It's basically here she is, and they go into the tent. They consummate the wedding, and that's it. It's over and it's done with. and they begin their lives as husband and wife. So Isaac taking Rebekah into the tent of his mother is another indication that the baton is being passed. She is becoming the replacement of Sarah. She is now the future matriarch of the nation of Israel that would eventually come. So Rebekah will share in Sarah's barrenness, and it is Isaac's prayers that will eventually open her womb. We read in Genesis 25:21, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord answered him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So she will also contribute to the family's dysfunction as she plays the role that she plays in tricking Isaac in the giving of the blessing and mixing up Jacob and Esau and that whole story, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so Isaac will be a pillar of faith, but he will also have his share of failures. The first of which that we would see is that Isaac duplicates Abraham's alleged trickery in presenting his wife as a sister, not as a wife, to the king Abimelech that Abraham had made a treaty with. And so you're going to see similar elements of faith and similar areas of failure in the life of both Isaac and Rebekah. So as we come to the end of this section, we're going to move very, very quickly into Abraham's death next time. As we think about this narrative of Abraham's preparation for future Israel, God's sovereign will cannot be stopped. We sometimes forget that. We wonder what God's sovereign will is. There's an enormous amount of God's permissive will that takes place. It doesn't mean that God has removed his hand from our lives or that God is just letting the world spin out as it might. God is in control. But the distinction between God's sovereign will is that it cannot be stopped no matter what man does. God's permissive will is what God allows for man to do, and then in the midst of that, God intervenes, God rescues, God disciplines, God guides, God instructs, etc., etc. And as we look back at this indication of God's sovereign hand in the life of Isaac and Rebekah, we will see God's sovereign hand continue to be poured out over the life of future Israel. And friend, it ought to be an encouragement to us to know that regardless of what takes place in our world, God is there, God is in control, God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes, and that he is worthy of our praise, of our glory, of the glory that can come from our lives, and from all that we can do to serve him. God wants to do in our lives similarly to what he did in the life of Abraham and Isaac, and what he'll do in the life of Jacob and Joseph and future Israel, that is to lead, to guide, so that we can bring him glory. Is that our desire, to see God do that? Do we want for God to carry out the plans and purposes he's orchestrated in our lives from before we were even saved? Our heart should scream, yes, God, we want that. And because of that, we pray that God would speak. Join me in prayer.